All right, fifth grade, we have finding common denominators to add, subtract, and compare fractions. So if you take a look up on the board here, uh, here I have common denominators. Remember, the denominator is always the bottom number in a fraction. So 4 and 4, those are common denominators. These here are not common denominators. I have a 2 in the denominator and a 4 in the denominator. Now, add, subtract, and compare. You might be able to compare fractions without changing the denominators. Like, you just know that 1/2 is bigger than 1/4. But adding and subtracting you can't really do unless you find the common denominator for both of them and change the fractions. So here are a few examples to show you how to do that. First, I have 1/2 plus 1/4. Now, typically when we add fractions, you add across the top numbers. But if you have different denominators, you can't just add across. First, you need to change the fractions to have like denominators. So just like in our lesson on percents, where you had to change your fraction into something over 100, that's kind of what we're doing here. Except we're not changing it to over 100, we're just changing it to where they're both the same. So I need to ask myself, what did I do to this denominator? What do I need to do to turn it into a 4? What do I need to multiply by or subtract or divide it by? Well, I know that 2 times 2 is 4. So I multiplied this by 2, which means I also need to multiply the top by 2. So I'm going to rewrite this as 2 over 4 plus 1 over 4. Now that I have common denominators, now I can add across. So 2 plus 1 is 3. So 3 over 4, 3/4 would be my solution. All right? Go ahead, try example 4 on your own. Try doing example 4 on your own. All right, so I have 1/3 plus 1/2. Now, in this case, I kind of run into a problem because I can't just multiply this 3 by something to make it a 2, or I can't just multiply the 2 by something to make it a 3. So I need to find the least common multiple of 3 and 2. I know that 3 times 2 is 6, and I know that 2 times 3 is 6, right? If I list out their multiples, I have 2, 4, 6, 8. If I list out these multiples, I have 3, 6, 9, 12. So I'm going to choose to turn both denominators into a 6. All right, so I'm going to do 3 times 2, which means I also need to multiply this top by 2. And I'm going to do 2 times 3, which means I also need to multiply the top by 3. Okay, so now I'm going to rewrite my problem. I have 2 over 6, because that's what this turns into. And then I have plus 3 over 6, because that's what this turns into. Now I can add my fractions by adding across. 2 plus 3 gives me 5. So 5 over 6 would be the solution to that problem. All right, another example. Example 3 here. This one's a little bit tricky. So I have 3 and 1/2 minus 1 and 1/6. If you want to try this on your own, you can, or you can just watch me do it. This one's kind of tricky because I have mixed numbers, not just improper, or not just fractions with unlike denominators. So I'm just going to focus on these fractions first here. That's what we just learned how to do. So 1/2 and 1/6. How do I get those to be the same denominator? Well, I can multiply 1/2 times 3 on the bottom and times 3 on the top, and that'll give me a 6 on the bottom. So I'll do that. So now I'm going to rewrite it as 3 and 3 over 6 minus 1 and 1 over 6. Now that makes it a little bit easier. Now you can subtract this like you normally subtract mixed numbers. So whole number and whole number, fraction and fraction. 3 minus 1 is 2, and 3/6 minus 1/6 gives me 2/6. So 2 and 2/6. And one last step is you need to simplify. You need to reduce. So this would become divide by 2, and this becomes 2 and 1/3 as my final answer. All right, let's do one word problem. In one of Katie's cookbooks, a recipe for salsa calls for 3/4 cup of chopped fresh cilantro. A salsa recipe given to Katie by a friend calls for 7/8 cup of chopped fresh cilantro. Which recipe calls for more cilantro? So here we're comparing 3/4 to 7/8. We want to know which one is greater. Is it Katie's recipe or is it Katie's friend's recipe? So 3/4 and 7/8. Once again, we just need to change them to be like denominators. So do I multiply or do I divide the 4 to get to an 8? Well, I would have to multiply because it's getting bigger. So 4 times 2 gives me 8. 3 times 2. Now I rewrite it. So now I have 6 over 8 and 7 over 8. Now I can clearly see that 7/8 is larger than 6/8, which means Katie's friend's recipe calls for more cilantro. All right, here is your lesson practice, which is part of your assignment. Quite a lengthy lesson practice today. All the way to Q. So today, that's your entire assignment. Just the lesson practice, none of the written practice. So if you complete A through Q, you're done with your homework for today.